So I don't know how much time you've spent with the book of Acts. I confess it has not always been my go-to book of the Bible, but these days it has been, because we're in an Acts kind of moment. Think about the early church. It started when a man died as a criminal at the hands of the Romans, and then came back to life, and then he left again after telling his friends, his disciples, to take his message of God's love to the ends of the earth. It's not how his disciples thought it was going to go. None of it was. But there they were, traveling around the known world and preaching about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, healing people in his name. They didn't have a 5-year plan for church growth. They couldn't look to history. They couldn't read old copies of annual reports to see how other disciples of other resurrected messiahs had done things. They were building an airplane as they flew it. Doesn't that feel like the world we're in now? None of us knew March 1st how to worship exclusively online, how to educate our kids on Zoom, how to navigate an economic downturn bigger than anything we've seen in 100 years, and yet here we are. They did not teach me this in seminary, is a thought I've had more than one time in the past months. I'm here in your sanctuary, but you're not. We'll be starting our ministry and time together in a different way than churches have ever done it before. And yet, here we are. And I'm grateful for signs of God's faithfulness that have brought us to this moment. Your pastor nominating committee, as you well know, has been faithfully preparing for this moment for a long time. And they didn't let quarantine slow them down, at least not too much. And God's call on my life through this process kept getting clearer and clearer, even though moving during a global pandemic was not anywhere on my 2020 bingo card. We may not know exactly how things are going to play out, but God has called us, and we will answer as best we can. So let's look at this story from Acts and see what it might have to say for us as we begin our ministry together. Peter and the disciples have been preaching, and it is a big deal. People are lining Peter's path just so his shadow might touch them. It is a world desperate for healing, and the disciples had big support from the people who needed healing, and they had no support from the people in power. Perhaps that's a reminder to us about how we measure our success. Do the people who need help think we're doing God's work, or do the people in power? The religious leaders are committed to keeping things the way they used to be. They put Peter and his companions in jail. They forbid them from preaching in their town. They still cannot control the disciples' message, so the religious authorities tweet about how it's fake news, about how the disciples are threatening law and order, how they wouldn't have been put in jail if they had only followed the rules. I suspect these religious authorities today would be suing to be able to worship in their buildings, even as it would put their people at risk, just because that's the way they've always done it. I want to pretend I'm more like Peter and the disciples than I am like the religious authorities, but I confess that sometimes I too can get entrenched in my own way of seeing things. I can persist in my wrongness as well. When they remind Peter that he's been forbidden from preaching his message, he replies, "Sorry, I answer to God. I don't answer to you." And that gets them in such a twist that they are enraged and want to kill him. And in steps Gamaliel. "Stop," he says. "Wait a minute, calm down." Gamaliel is willing to stand up for his friends when they are in a lather and about to kill the disciples. We don't know much about Gamaliel. According to a reference later in the book of Acts, he was Paul's teacher, and he taught him everything he knew of the Hebrew law. Some Christian traditions like to claim that he secretly converted to Christianity. Jewish tradition says he was a Pharisee and a leader in the Sanhedrin. What we do know from this text is that he was brave and calm and willing to stand up to an angry mob of his friends and try to talk them back from their bloodlust. Gamaliel, of course, had been in that community long enough to remember many situations that might help them in their current predicament. He remembers when Theudas rose up. Yeah, he drew quite a crowd, but nothing came of it. Everything went back to normal. He remembered when Judas the Galilean rose up. Nothing came of his rebellion either, and his followers scattered. It's not written in Acts, but I bet Gamaliel also remembered the time when everyone came to temple and the pews were packed and the paint was new on the walls and they had more kids in Sunday school than they knew what to do with. Good, bad, and everything in between, he has institutional memory. And this is one of those times when they need to be reminded of where they have been, not so they can return to that time in the past, but so they can navigate how they are supposed to live together into the future. This is the moment we find ourselves in, too. How do we live into an unknown future? I'm curious to learn about your past and what parts of it you would lift up for me to help me get to know the things that are essential to who Calvary is. It's a real question. I invite you to think about it. Consider it your summer homework. Gamaliel uses the past to give them permission to take a longer view on the situation. Let's let it rest for a while, he says. See what happens. Let it play out. So in the present case, I tell you, he says, keep away from these men and let them alone, because if this plan or this undertaking is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. And in that case, you might be found to be fighting against God. Is it human origin? Is it divine origin? What I love about this passage is the reminder that things that are of human origin have a limited shelf life, but things that are divine will stand the test of time, and sometimes it takes a while to know the difference. We are called to have a larger perspective, to give things time, and perhaps, and maybe most importantly, we have to be willing to be wrong. Gamaliel does not endorse Peter and the disciples. He doesn't say they've got it right, but he acknowledges they might be right. And if the disciples were right about this Jesus guy, then that means the temple leaders are wrong. Who wants to be found fighting against God? Lots of us, apparently. We see it all the time. We get so entrenched in our way of seeing things that we cannot change course. We can't entertain new perspectives. We can't admit when we were wrong. And our entrenchment in our mistakes gets deeper and deeper, and it leads us to create a reality to defend our viewpoints. In the book, Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Us, the authors recount this story. In the 1950s, a young social psychologist named Leon Festinger and two associates infiltrated a group of people who believed the world would end on December 21st. They wanted to know what would happen to the group, they hoped, when the prophecy failed, and the group's leader, whom the researchers called Marion Keach, promised that the faithful would be picked up by a flying saucer and elevated to safety at midnight on December 20th. Many of her followers quit their jobs, they gave away their homes, they dispersed their savings, waiting for the end. Who needs money in outer space? I would take money. Anyways, that's another story. Others waited in fear or in resignation back in their homes. Mrs. Keach's own husband, who was a non-believer, went to bed early and slept soundly through the night as his wife and her followers prayed in his living room. Festinger made his own prediction that the believers who had not made a strong commitment to the prophecy, who awaited the end of the world by themselves back at their own homes, hoping they wouldn't die at midnight, he believed they would lose their faith in Mrs. Keach. But those who had given away their possessions and were waiting with the others for the spaceship would increase their belief in her mystical abilities. And in fact, they would now do everything they could to get others to join them in their beliefs. At midnight, with no sign of a spaceship in the yard, the group felt a little nervous. By 2 a.m., they were getting seriously worried. At 4:45 a.m., Mrs. Keach had a new vision. The world had been spared, she said, because of the impressive faith of her band of followers. And mighty is the word of God, she told her followers, and by his word we have been saved. For from the mouth of death you have been delivered, and at no time has there been such a force loosed on the earth. Not since the beginning of the earth has there been such a force of good and light as now floods this room. The group's mood shifted from despair to exhilaration, and many of the group's members who had not felt the need to proselytize before December 21st began calling the press to report a miracle, and soon they were out in the streets buttonholing passersby, trying to convert them. Festinger coined the behavior and coined the term cognitive dissonance over this study, the state of tension that occurs whenever a person holds two cognitions, ideas or attitudes or beliefs or opinions that are psychologically inconsistent. We experience cognitive dissonance in big and in small ways. We know what a healthy diet looks like, yet I love French fries. We know smoking causes cancer and other bad health outcomes, yet people still smoke. We know our dependence on fossil fuels is bad for the environment and is not sustainable for the future, yet we still drive gas-powered cars as if their convenience outweighs the cost. In the Acts story, the temple leaders were entrenched in their story. Well, we didn't kill Jesus, Pilate killed Jesus, and Jesus was a troublemaker. He was preaching blasphemy, and it wasn't our fault that he said all those things and got himself in trouble. They could have seen the healings done in his name and said, maybe we made a mistake. They could have seen the crowds converted upon hearing the good news, lining up to be baptized, and realized they had missed something, and they couldn't do it. They had to keep telling the story they'd already told, even as it was wrong. Gamaliel tries to open them up for a new narrative, one where they can back down from their rigid perspectives and find a new path toward the future. What I need to be reminded about again and again is that it's important to be wrong, at least to be willing to be wrong, because making mistakes is part of being human. So we try something, we do our best. Some days it works, some days it doesn't. One of the gifts of being church is that church is one of the places where we can cultivate the relationships we need to help each other out of our cognitive dissonance, where we can ask each other, are we sure we're getting this right? Do we need to change our minds? There's a church in Boise right now that is in the midst of some cognitive dissonance on the news. This sanctuary was built in the 1950s. It's a gorgeous cathedral-like downtown church with beautiful stained glass windows. And this congregation partners with the one I've been serving on issues of welcome and inclusion and anti-racism. They do good and important work in our community. And I recently discovered that one of their stained glass windows has Robert E. Lee in it, a Confederate general standing next to Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. I have zero idea why a church built in Idaho 100 years after the Civil War would include a Confederate general in their sanctuary, but there he is. This week, the leaders of the church announced the window will come down and the traitorous Confederate will be replaced with a Black American yet to be determined. The Boise church has had a Gamaliel moment. There had been other voices in the past who had questioned the window, but someone whose voice they could finally hear finally said, why are we defending a Confederate general in our sanctuary? I don't know why this church is listening now when they didn't hear it earlier, but it's better late than never, right? I'm wondering how many other Gamaliel moments we're seeing in our country right now. NASCAR and branches of the military have finally banned the Confederate flags as symbols. The Southern Baptist Convention just spoke out on behalf of Black Lives Matter, calling it a gospel issue. A country singing trio, Lady Antebellum, just apologized for choosing a name that had such connections to slavery and changed their name to Lady A, which I also found out later is already the name of another performing group, and maybe they should have Googled it, but that's another story. Now, finally, dare we hope, our culture is moving out of our cognitive dissonance about the systemic nature of racism in our country. Hopefully, finally, we are recognizing some of the ways we've been fighting against God. Hopefully, we are starting to let go of a lot of ideas that were of human origin and not divine. And we can wish things had changed sooner, but we can be thankful things are changing now, and we can commit to continuing the work of anti-racism that is so desperately needed in our country right now. Because our Black siblings are tired, and they are tired of dying, and they are tired of having to explain again and again to white America what the issue is. With what's happening in America right now in response to the protests surrounding the death of George Floyd, it is as if once one Gamaliel speaks up, it gives cover for another one to speak up to. We shouldn't need cover to say the right thing, to do the right thing. But maybe the question is, who needs you to be Gamaliel right now? It may or may not be about racism, but think about the times that we all keep silent because it's just not worth the hassle to question our family member or our coworker or our friends when they are persisting in their wrongness. Where are the situations where we can ask, wait a minute, Let's think about that again. Maybe we need to change our minds. You as a congregation have already had to change your minds about a lot of things since the virus hit, and I've been silently worshiping online along with you the past number of weeks, and I've been impressed with how well your pastoral staff has pivoted to change the way worship happens. It's not the same as worshiping together in your building, but it's much better than any of us would have thought it could be before the quarantine started. And you've also managed to continue vital ministries of the church, distributing food to hungry people in your community and finding other mission assistance that needs doing. You've showed up with appropriate social distancing at rallies and vigils, recognizing that the need for justice doesn't take a break. There's a lot we don't know about how the coming months will play out, but we do know that Calvary is a church with a rich history of caring for the people of San Francisco. So how can we live into that calling in new ways in the time to come? Like the disciples in the Acts passage, we are in a world desperate for healing. How is God calling us to respond? Morgan Harper Nichols is a singer and a poet, and recently she wrote these words that embody the challenge we face, both as a nation and as any individual congregation. So here's to new beginnings, she writes, knowing it is impossible to ignore the long history, opening up to the mystery that grace still finds you here. And grace is unmerited favor, but it might not always look the way you want it to. It will invite you out in the open, and it will also reveal what has been broken. You might have to unlearn the way you thought things would be. You might find that being undone is the best way to move on, humbly, mindfully, wholly. For how liberating it is to pursue wholeness over perfection, finding that grace is more than a beautiful word, but a daily act of being undone, an awakening, a direction. I pray we, like Gamaliel, will keep our eyes open for the Spirit of God moving in our midst, working for divine plans in the midst of our human error-filled ways, so we might be agents of God's healing for the world. And I'm looking forward to being on this journey with you so we can figure it out together. May grace undo and awaken us each day. Amen.